This module is titled Variables and Constants. My name is Mark Zamoyda. Single pieces of information in JavaScript get stored in variables and constants. So these are very important and are used throughout most of our code. In this module, we'll go over these in detail. We'll start off by defining what a variable is and how it works. We'll see how to declare variables so we can use them in our code. We want to give our variables descriptive names, and there are certain rules we need to follow when naming our variables. And there are certain errors that are very common when using variables. We'll see how to detect these and correct them. And the reason why a variable is called a variable is because the value changes or varies over time. We'll see how this takes place in JavaScript, and then we'll look at constants, which are cousins to variables. They seem similar, but they can only have one value that never changes. And finally, we'll look at the Var keyword. It's not a best practice to use the Var keyword anymore in JavaScript, since there are better keywords that we'll be learning about to declare variables and constants. But you'll still run into this in legacy code, on Stack Overflow, and in blog entries. So it's important to know how Var works. So let's start off by looking at what a variable really is. Any application that we write is going to be based on data. If we're selling products, we need data on the product name, the price, and all the data that belongs to an invoice or a purchase order. If you're writing an app that works within a car, you might need access to data such as the speed of the vehicle, the engine size, or just anything about that vehicle. Likewise, with a game, you might need data such as the high score or the images used for a player's animation. And in JavaScript and most other programming languages, we use variables to hold this information. Data is stored in the computer memory. Let's take a look at an example here. Let's say we have a sales ticket and the total amount of that sales ticket is $149.99. That needs to be stored somewhere in the computer's memory. And typically a memory address is a long, complicated number. It would be very difficult if we had to use this long number to reference that value. So instead we use a variable. In this case, we can use a variable called total. So in this case, we're using an English word to represent the number in the computer. And you can use words and characters from your own native language. It's up to us to come up with the variable names. Likewise, if we had a product that we need to store, such as hiking boots, that would be stored in computer memory. And again, it would have a memory address, which would be very difficult to work with. So instead, we come up with a variable called product. And one more example, let's say we had a value called true, and we have no idea what that refers to. We know it has a memory location, but if we give it a good variable name, we'll know exactly what true means. Here the variable name is discounted. So if the value of discounted is true, we know there's some kind of discount going on for a product. If the value is false, there would not be a discount. So in this example, we have three variables: total, product, and discounted. And it's up to us to come up with the variable names. There's a special terminology we use in programming when you create a variable. It's called declaring the variable. And in the next clip, we'll see how we declare variables in JavaScript. We need to let JavaScript know what variables we're going to be working with. And the terminology we use for that is declaring variables. Let's see how we do that. When we declare a variable, we use a keyword, let. A keyword is a special symbol that JavaScript knows about. It performs some type of action. In this case, let allows us to declare a variable. And after the keyword let, we have the variable name that we want to use. And there are certain rules for creating variable names, and we'll cover those shortly. But for now, just know that you can use any word for your native language. After the new variable name, in this case total, we have an equal sign, followed by, in this case, the number, $149.99. What this equal sign does is it takes the value and assigns it to the variable, total. So you would say the variable total now has the value $149.99. And it's the best practice to always end a line of code with the semicolon. So we do that here. Let's see another example. We use the keyword let, and we're creating a new variable name called product. And we're assigning product hiking boots. Now you'll notice that hiking boots are in single quotation marks. This is called a string. Our computers and devices have no idea what hiking boots are. So by putting them in quotes, we can just treat that text as literal text. We can put any words we'd like between quotes. And you'll notice that computers do understand numbers, so we don't use quotes when we're working with numbers, as in 149 and 99 cents. So again, for this line, we're creating a new variable, product, and assigning it the value hiking boots. In this third example, we're using let to create a variable named discounted, and we're using the equal sign to assign the value true to discounted. Now you'll notice true is not in quotes. The values true and false are called Boolean values, and they're used so often that JavaScript knows about them. We don't need quotes around true or false. So we're creating these three variables. Total will be set to 149.99, product will be set to hiking boots, and discounted will be set to true. Looking at our diagram again, we have our variables showing on the left, and JavaScript knows all about these now. JavaScript keeps track of the memory locations and can pull up their values. In the next clip, we'll pull up Visual Studio and we'll start creating our own variables. Let's go into Visual Studio and we'll use the let keyword to declare our first variables. Here's our project from the last module. I'll go into Visual Studio Code and hit Control backtick, and let's make sure our web server is running. I'll type npm start. And there we have it in the browser. So to create our first variable, let me close down the Explorer so we have some room. And we use the let keyword. And let's create a variable called welcome. And we want to assign a value to welcome. Let's assign it the string welcome. And again, we're using text, so we need to put it in quotes. This is called a string, and we'll learn all about strings in the next module. But for now, just know that we can use single quotes or double quotes, as you see here in the title, when we're working with strings. Now to show a message, let's say we wanted to show the message that's held in the variable welcome. We can just enter the variable name. So here in line 2, we're creating our variable welcome and assigning it the string welcome with a capital W. And then we call show message with that variable name. I'll save this and let's see what happens. We get our welcome message in the web page. If we change the welcome to hello world, I'll save it. And now that shows up in the web page. So simply by changing this string that we're assigning to welcome, we can have our program behave differently. This line of code stays the same. What's important is the value that's stored inside the variable. And let's change this variable. Instead of welcome, we'll say price. And we'll enter a number for the price, $49.99. And we'll show the message price. I'll save it, and we get the value $49.99 showing. Usually your programs will have many variables. Let's say we have a price, and we also have a variable called name for like a product name. And let's say we also had a variable called discounted. And that'll be true or false, whether the item is discounted. I'll just say false for now. And we can go ahead and use these three variables, price, name, and discounted, throughout our code. I'll just show the message discounted. I'll save it, and we get false, which is the correct value. There's a shorthand that you're usually going to see when we're declaring multiple variables like this. We can actually leave out the second and third let and put commas between the different variables and their assignments. So we'll say let price equal $49.99, comma, name equals hiking boots, comma, and discounted equals false. That's our last variable, so we'll put a semicolon on the end. And this works just as well. I'll save it, and we get false for discounted. If we want to show the message name, I'll save it, and we get hiking boots. So it's not required to use commas when you're declaring multiple variables, but it's very common, and it is a best practice. Usually you'll see the variable names lined up like this, so that it's easier to read. Remember, you can freely use whitespace between symbols and before and after variable names. So declaring variables is easy, but there are some errors that can come up. And usually those errors have to do with the names that you pick for variables. So in the next clip, we'll take a look at the rules for naming variables. Let's take a look at the names that we can use for variables. We can pretty much use any word as long as it's not a keyword, such as let. Let is used to declare variables, and if we try to create a variable named let, that would be very confusing, and JavaScript will give us an error. But let's take a look at the rules. So for valid variable names, A variable needs to start with one of these characters, underscore, $, or a letter. And by letter, we mean lowercase a to z or uppercase a to z or any Unicode letter. So that covers most languages. So after we have our first character in the variable name, it can be followed by 0 or more of these characters, underscores, $, letters, or numbers. So the big difference here is that you cannot start a variable name with a number. Any numbers have to be in position 2 or beyond. And the reason for that is that if you started a variable name with a number, the JavaScript engine would be confused. It wouldn't know if you're trying to create a number or a variable name. Let's see some examples. The letter A is a valid variable because it starts with a letter, and that's the only character. But the problem with this isn't technical with JavaScript, but it's a problem with your source code and the ability to understand your source code. If you use a variable A, people won't have an idea what you're really talking about. But if you use a variable name such as account, that's much more descriptive, and it's a much better variable name than A. We could also create a variable called account underscore 99. That's fine. Just as long as it doesn't begin with a number, we can use numbers. And in this case, we have a variable called account number. You'll notice that the word account is lowercase, but the word number is uppercase. This is called camel notation because there seems to be a bump in the middle of the word, like a camel. And it's very common to use camel case when we're working with JavaScript variables. Account number is a great variable name. It completely describes what we're working with. But to make it easier to read, we use this camel notation. You'll also see variables that begin with an underscore. That's valid. So underscore account number. Usually the underscore denotes that this variable is going to be private in some way. And you'll learn more about that in a more advanced course on JavaScript objects. But it is a valid variable name to start it with an underscore. Likewise, you can start a variable name with a $sign. Generally, $signs are used for automatically generated code, which is an advanced subject. But for the most part, $signs are discouraged in variable names. And you could even have a variable name such as underscore 123. And that's very non-descriptive, so it's probably not a good choice for a name. You'll also see variables that look like this. They have 2 underscores at the beginning, at the end, and some word in the middle. And you'll run into these, but these are usually reserved for non-standard features. So while all these variable names are valid, the best ones are account, account number, and just any name that really describes the data that is being held by that variable. If there's a problem with a variable name, JavaScript will usually let you know. And we'll take a look at that in the next clip, where we'll look at errors with variables. Let's look at some of the common errors that we might run into when using variables. All of these errors can be avoided by understanding the rules, and also by following best practices. Here's our code from the last time we were in Visual Studio Code. And let's just work with an illegal variable name. Now we know variables cannot begin with a number, so let's try to create a variable called 99 times. And we'll set that equal to 99. And we'll show message 99 times. Now you can already tell in the editor that we're going to have an error. These red squiggly lines show us that there's some problem with the source code. But I'll go ahead and save it and we'll see what happens anyway. I'll save it. I'll pull up the inspector by right-clicking and choosing Inspect. I'll go to the console, and you can see the error that we get. Uncaught syntax error, invalid or unexpected token. By token, they mean a symbol. In this case, the symbol is 99 times. So variable names cannot begin with a number. We can simply fix this by renaming it. Let's call it times 99. And we'll change it in the show message call as well. I'll save it. And 99 shows up in our browser and the error goes away. Again, it's fair if we used an underscore. That's a valid way to start a variable name. I'll save this and that shows the same result. But we can't have spaces in variable names. If I put a space here, again, we'll get the squiggly lines and we're sure to get an error. I'll save it and we get a syntax error, unexpected number. So variable names cannot have spaces. Likewise, variable names cannot be keywords. The main keyword we've looked at so far is let. So let's try to create a variable called let and see what happens. I'll save it. And we get an uncaught syntax error. Let is disallowed as a lexically bound name. Now that sounds like a complex message, but basically what it's saying is that let is used by JavaScript as a keyword, and we can't use it for a variable name. One other problem we sometimes have with variables, I'll create one called price here, is not initializing the variable. So it is valid to create a line like this, let price, without assigning it a value. Let's see what happens. I'll save this. And when we look at the message we get, you can see there is no message. It doesn't show anything. And let's also write this to the console. Earlier we saw how we can write console.log, and I'll enter the variable name here, price. I'll save this. And if we look in the console, we get the word undefined. So an error isn't being generated, but most likely this is an error in our code. We have to set price to something. So this is more of a best practice. Whenever you declare a variable, also set its value. I'll save this and everything should work fine. We're good. So those are some of the common errors you run into. Make sure to leave your console open so you can see these errors as they pop up. Now I haven't really explained why we use the word variable to describe variables. And the reason why is because they change over time. The value of a variable can vary. It can change. And we'll take a look at that in the next clip. Let's take a look at changing variable values. A variable changes over time. If you're talking about the speed of a car, it's going to change often. If you're talking about a score in a game, that's going to change often as well. So let's see how we accomplish this in JavaScript code. So let's go ahead and work with price. We're setting price to $99.99. I'll save it and we can see that that works fine. But over time, price might change. And we can simply set price to a new value by writing a statement. We'll enter the variable name equals $49.99. So this line of code is how we can assign a new value to a variable. We use the equal sign and we take the new value, $49.99, and place it into price, the variable. So when I save this, even though we initially set price to $99.99, we reset it to $49.99, and that's what shows up in the browser. Sometimes you might not know the value of price at the start of your code. In that case, it's fine to leave out any assignment. Or you can set price equal to 0 or some other value. But let's just leave it out for now. You just need to make sure that between the place where we declare price and down here on line 6 where we use price, we need to set that variable between those two places. And we're doing that. So if I set this to $59.99 and save it, everything works fine. And of course, there might be some code in here to somehow calculate the price or grab it off the internet or do some kind of processing. And there might be more code here, and maybe even the value of price changes again. Let's make it $29.99. So the value can change multiple times while the code is running. I'll save this, and you'll see that we get the final value that price was set to, $29.99. So that wraps up the fundamentals of variables. Now there's a cousin to a variable called a constant, and a constant does not change. We'll take a look at that in the next clip. We just saw how variables can change all the time, but sometimes we want a variable to only be set once and not change at all. In that case, we use a constant. The big benefit of a constant is that it gives a clue to developers, especially developers looking at your code in the future, that something is not supposed to change. Let's take a look at this in Visual Studio Code. Here's our code from earlier, where we're not setting price at all at the beginning. Then we set it to $59.99, and then we set it to $29.99. Let's say we wanted to only set the value of price once. Instead of let, we would use the keyword const for constant. And when you declare a constant like this, constant price, again, a constant has the same variable rules as variables. We'll set a constant price equal to, let's just say $40. And I'll comment out this other code for now, where we're changing price. So we're taking the value 40 and assigning it to the constant price. And then we're showing a message with price in it. I'll save this, and our 40 shows up. But this is a constant, so if a developer tried to change it, as I'll do right here, I'll uncomment this line, and we should get an error. We have a constant price, but we're changing its value. So I'll save this, Control S, and I'll go to the console. And you'll notice that this gets paused in the debugger. So I'll just hit this blue button to resume. And we get our error. Uncaught type error. Assignment to constant variable at home.js, line number 6. So you can see that this does generate an error. If you're curious about what a type error is, type refers to the type of information we're dealing with. And we'll see all about that in the next module of this course. But for now, just know that we're assigning a value to a constant twice, which is illegal. Likewise, I'll take out all this code here now. And what if we don't set any value to the constant? We'll just say const price. I'll save this. And we get a different error message, uncaught syntax error, missing initializer in const declaration. So when we declare a constant, we need to set it to a value. I'll save this and everything works fine. So you have a choice to make. When you need a variable, you need to determine whether or not that variable is ever going to change. If it's not going to change, use a constant. And you declare that as you see here with the const keyword. But if the variable is going to change, you need to declare it with let. If you're in doubt, you can always declare things as a constant and then change it back to let later if needed. And that is the best practice. If a variable is not going to change, it should be declared as a constant, as a best practice. Now these keywords let and const are relatively new to the JavaScript language. We used to declare variables with a keyword called var. And var has some problems, and it's a best practice to use let and const instead of var. But we'll take a look at that in the next clip. We saw how we should be using the let and const keywords to declare variables and constants. However, those are relatively new keywords, and there's still a lot of code out there that uses the var keyword to declare a variable. If you look on Stack Overflow or blogs on the internet, as well as some older code, you'll run across this var keyword often. So let's take a look at it. So the old way to declare variables is with var, V-A-R. So we're setting price to the value 20 by using the var keyword, and then we'll show message price. Actually, let's change this to 25. I'll save it, and we can see it update in the browser. So it appears that this works similarly to let, but let's see one of the main differences between var and let. The correct way to declare a variable is with let, and if we try to show the message price before we declare the variable, I'll save this. I'll go to the console and resume the script, and we get an uncaught reference error, cannot access price before initialization. And that makes sense. Our code executes from top to bottom. So when we show message price, JavaScript has no idea what price is. It can't predict the future. And that's a good error message that helps us. But if we use the var keyword instead of price, I'll save this, and we'll take a look at it. And you can see that we do not get an error. The price isn't showing above the 20% off as it usually does, but looking in the console, there is no error. And this is one of the big problems with using var as a keyword. You don't get errors that you expect. Not only that, but if we try to log out price, I'll enter console.log price. I'll save this. And when we look in the console, we get a message undefined. And that's kind of confusing. Price shouldn't really exist until it gets declared. So as a best practice, always use the let keyword. That way, if there's a problem with your code, it'll show up as an error. I'll go to the console and resume, and we get the error that we expect. Of course, the way to fix the error is to use the variable price after we set it. I'll save it, and everything works fine. So that wraps up this module. In the next clip, we'll summarize what we covered. We started off this module by defining what a variable is. Instead of using complex memory locations, we can use symbols, which are words in our native language. This makes programming much easier. We saw how we could declare new variables by using the let keyword. And we saw that there are some rules for naming variables. Specifically, they must begin with an underscore, a $, or a letter. That could be the typical uppercase and lowercase English letters, A to Z, or any Unicode letter. And then that first symbol is followed by 0 or more underscores, $, letters, or numbers. Just remember, a variable name cannot begin with a number. Next, we looked at some of the common errors that occur when we're using variables. We saw how they appear in the console and how to fix them. Next, we saw how variables change over time as our code executes. But there are some symbols that we don't want to change over time, and these are called constants. They're declared with the const keyword instead of let. And finally, we looked at the var keyword. We saw how there are some problems associated with this, and we shouldn't really use it. We should use let or const to declare variables and constants. You'll still see var used in source code, whether it's on Stack Overflow, a blog, or somewhere else on the internet, because most of JavaScript's life, var was the only way to declare variables. But now we have let and const, and it's the best practice to use them. So that wraps up our introduction to variables and constants. The next thing we need to learn about is types. Every variable or constant has a type associated with it. It can be a number, a string, a Boolean value, as we've seen. Boolean values, again, are true and false. And we'll learn all about JavaScript types in the next module.